Hi, welcome to the Unbelief Podcast. I'm Jeremy Steele, and I am here with Justice Hunter, or sorry, Justice Mitchell, and we'll start that again. Hi, welcome to the Unbelief Podcast. I am Jeremy, and I'm here with the Reverend Justice Mitchell. But interesting, Justice is a Reverend, but he is also an LCSW. He is a clinical social worker, he's a therapist, and he works with people who have religious trauma. And so we're going to actually do some Q&A about the about religious trauma and what that is, what that means, and answer your specific questions. You right now have access to a religious trauma specialist. And so Justin, welcome to the podcast and our live stream. Um, Thank you for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yeah. I'm curious, just to sort of start out, if you have questions for Justice, go ahead and let us know a little bit. Put your question in the comments. We are live on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. I will be looking for your comments on all those platforms, and we're going to do our best to answer as many of them as possible. Justice, um, do you mind just describing for people what is religious trauma? Because I know that um, sometimes people hear that term and they think, "Oh my gosh, everything is trauma." Like, what does that mean? uh, and a lot of people, my experience is like they say like, "I don't have that," and then you talk to it about them like, "Oh, yeah." So, what is religious trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. And yeah, the definition of religious trauma is something kind of in the clinical space that is not as foundationally defined. And so we kind of work on some
Hmm.
research that we have. And so definition that I really lean on is from the Religious Trauma Institute. And
Okay.
it defines it as a physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious practices, beliefs, or structures that a
Uh-huh.
person experiences as overwhelming or disruptive, or kind of has some type of like adverse effect on their well-being, whether that be their physical, their mental, their social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So
Right.
just a pretty adverse reaction to something they hear in a religious space. And so it could be in a religious space. It also could be like religion is so permeated into outside of religion in religious churches and spaces as well, and is pretty, yeah, has infiltrated a lot of the kind of zeitgeist, as you would say, of like what it means to be particularly like American and in this world that we live in. And so part of that work, yeah, is also recognizing that that is part of it, is that religion is everywhere. And so we all are affected by religious uh, language in a lot of ways.
Right. So, tell me a little bit about when you are approaching that and trying to help somebody understand whether where um, uh, understand about um, their own religious trauma. Like, what are some questions that you ask them to try to help them uh, to process and explore that specific thing?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the work that I do, and so I work under predominantly a modality called narrative therapy. And
Uh-huh.
so what we do is we do storytelling in therapy spaces. And so we work on like how do we tell the story on so many different aspects of our life, but particularly in like religious trauma spaces, we'll get a full narrative of like what has religious formation looked like for you throughout your whole lifetime. And so
Right.
for some folks, it's like, yeah, pretty clear kind of mile markers of grew up in the church, experienced this harm or experienced this teaching that really like affected me
Right.
and like the church and kind of that. But then sometimes it's a little bit more subtle. And so what I do as a therapist is I listen for language and
Okay.
what language and religious kind of religious phrases that maybe are more coded as religious, that are more common in our kind of cultural lingo, pop up all the time. And so my job is to listen for those and kind of hear some of that coded language. And whenever I hear it, to be able to be like, oh, you said this. What does that mean?
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So, as you are doing that, I'm curious, as people are putting their questions in the comments for you. Uh, uh, Justice is a religious trauma therapist. What are some common things that you hear people report, like some things that they've experienced that have traumatized them? Are there categories? Are there broad common things that you hear often?
Yeah. And so, I think there's a few different kind of things that I hear probably the most. And there's a really useful tool that I have found for this work that I do online
Uh-huh.
called the Religious Power and Control Wheel.
Okay.
And it looks at kind of what in the religious trauma space we would call like high control religion.
Okay.
And it looks at different like asset or facets of that work. And so it's like
Okay.
when a piece of the chart is like a pie graph almost. One piece of the chart is like financial control. And so it's looking at like
Hmm.
how a church or a high control religious space has used finances in a way that has been like traumatic.
Right. And
It's
and
like,
what are some ways that churches do that?
through asking people to um, more than just asking people to give their money to support the church, and kind of making that more of like, hey, if you don't do this, then you can't participate in this community. Or if you don't do this, then we're going to continue to ask you until you do, or kind of use this in a very forceful way. Or if the second that you stop giving money, if you've been giving money, then that's when an isolation and ostracization kind of happens from that religious space, and it becomes a controlling thing of controlling how much you are spending in this space, in a church space, and also recognizing a lot of those high control spaces also have access to your finances in a way that's more controlling than just like a donation in the offering plate. It's much more broad reaching.
Yeah, we have one comment from Julie Beam. She says her past therapist didn't have a clue about the experiences of growing up in evangelicalism. Like purity culture blew his mind,
Yeah,
which I think this is really important for people who grew up in these high control religious spaces and now are trying to go to therapy. So what do you look for? Like if you're looking for a therapist, this might be part of it, and you want to make sure they can help you process it.
yeah,
What do you look for?
I think part of the work is that this kind of specialty in religious trauma and kind of religious trauma in general uh,
Hmm.
is still very new to the clinical research of like what it
Right.
means to be a therapist and in kind of the like mental health space. There's still not technically a formal diagnosis for like religious trauma syndrome, um,
Okay.
and so kind
Right,
of
and that's because the manual for diagnostic criteria, which is like the DSM,
yeah,
that's not updated very regularly, right?
no, no, and
So it
also
doesn't mean that it is not a real thing. It just means that since it's really been defined, there hasn't been an update to the diagnostic criteria.
and so a lot of but still a lot of therapists will kind of work under some definitions that we have, and so a lot of
Sure.
therapists will work under like religious trauma being um, a facet of what we would call maybe like a complex PTSD or some type of
Okay.
chronic trauma that's more of recognizing that even if it's not like a capital T trauma event that happened
Uh-huh.
to you at this specific age in this specific time, it's still something that we can kind of work at in recognizing that being in a system of belief for a long time affects a person.
Right.
And
And
so,
so for people like Julie, like when they're looking for it,
yeah,
like what do they look for?
and I think looking for. I mean, there's more and more people kind of popping up that are doing this work, and so I think
Hmm.
searching for specifically like religious trauma or spiritual abuse therapists are
Hmm.
important. But also, looking for people who maybe have some level of theological training in
Okay.
ways that can be also hard to look for because there's a lot of differences what it means to be theologically trained in the
Yeah.
therapeutic space.
Yeah. And I have experienced that like when you look for religious training that overlaps with therapy, uh, so often you end up with people that would call themselves like Christian therapists,
Yeah.
right? And the a lot of the people that have talked to me about their experiences with those people is, they'll say that they kept sort of spouting evangelical dogma, right? Offering offering insight that actually made their trauma worse.
Yeah. 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 And that's I mean, a big thing that I run into a lot in the work that I do, being a theologically trained individual in the therapeutic
Yeah,
space. But for me, it also helps sometimes I'm also like in my kind of professional profiles online.
yeah,
It's very clear that like I also like am a queer person and also do this work. And so
right.
I, as an individual, paint a very different vision of what Christian therapist might look like. And so
Right.
by being
So
present in that
you're
space,
just this like ball of complexity. You are a queer
yeah,
person. You are a reverend. You are an
yeah,
LCSW.
I
um,
contain so many multitudes.
right. So Davey DMark on Instagram is asking, aren't most evangelical churches inherently controlling? I love this question because um, it gets to the root of like when you say a high control religion, like what does that mean?
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I think I've had a lot of conversations with folks about like, well, isn't religion kind of inherently controlling in some ways of asking you to do things or asking you to believe certain things? And
Hmm.
to an extent, yes, that is a part of what it means to be a religious person is to be adhering to a set of beliefs
Hmm.
that you're being guided in by some type of like higher power or presence or even like spiritual leaders within church spaces. But if
Sure.
that starts to get to a space that is causing you some level of distress, and so the work that
Hmm.
I do, like I lean into the distress a person is experiencing.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard for me to go into spaces and be like, you have trauma, because like some folks, they don't think that. They don't think that that is their reality. And
Yeah.
there's nothing that I can really do until someone is starting to recognize that as their reality. And so it's leaning into the distress that a person is experiencing at how controlling a space is. And yeah,
Yeah. And I think, I think my response to this question would be that I would not say that like evangelical churches are inherently controlling. I think they have a very, in general, they have a very narrow view of what adherence to Christianity means. But I think it is, at least for me, it is the way they communicate and enforce that view, right?
yeah,
It's are you publicly shamed for asking questions? Are you is your connection to the community and the supportive part of that community dependent on you adhering to this set of beliefs? Are you are there things that is there a do people there use the religion to manipulate you? Things like a pastor asking about a person, details of a person's life, but saying like, I'm just want to pray for them. But they're not asking a person; they're asking a third party to kind of investigate. I think those kinds of things are where it really gets into high control. And so I appreciate the like. Yes, I think that the theology of evangelicalism is ripe for getting taken into this high control space, but I do believe that it is possible to have that view and not try to control, like have that view yourself, have that view as an organization, but not implement it in a way that is actually controlling people.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And kind of the work that this kind of religious power and control is wrapped up in is also like I ask a lot of curious questions in my therapy work of like as we begin to talk about this work, asking like, what would happen if you were to, I don't know, challenge something that your church has said, or even like ask a question, or like even if
Hmm.
you ever experience like doubt in your religious space and you were to
Yeah.
voice that, how do you think your religious leaders would handle that? And
Yeah.
often questions like that are really telling of like what kind of space they're in. Because if a church or a space that they're in is really like, well, I cannot ask any questions and I can't question anything that I've been taught, then it's starting to give some signals of like, okay, this could be pretty controlling.
Yeah. Okay. So another user is asking, what do you think of pastoral counseling? Um, we are both reverends.
Yeah.
I'm gonna, since you're an actual therapist, I'm gonna give sort of my idea, and I'd love if I'm completely wrong, please tell me,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then let's hear like something more therapeutic and detailed from you. But so for me, my training is a pastor. And my understanding of what that means is I can care for people, but in the spiritual dimension of their life. One of the primary tasks for me is to help them find religious beliefs and practices that work for them, help them become the best version of themselves, find a purpose greater than themselves, experience transcendence, and so you know, just so people are able to book time with me for pastoral conversations. And I like to say pastoral conversations instead of pastoral counseling, um, because one of the things when people book that time with me, that it says where they book it in the confirmation email is Jeremy is not a therapist.
Yeah.
If you were going to that, he can help you find somebody. Um, uh, and so, like, if you come to me and just a couple of days ago somebody came to me and said like I'm really having a lot of anxiety, having panic attacks, and my initial thing was like, okay, I cannot help you deal with anxiety or panic attacks. Like, I don't want to screw you up, I'm not qualified for that. But if there's a religious component of that, then we can have that conversation and I can help you process that. And that there actually was, right? The reason they came to me is because they had these like intrusive thoughts of things that they had thought and said that they thought might make them instantly go to hell. And so we did have that conversation. And so I would say I really don't like the concept, the term pastoral counseling, because I think it enables pastors to go into areas where they are not qualified. You do have some courses in seminary, if you go to seminary, of pastoral counseling, like this modality that you use called narrative therapy. I did have some training in narrative therapy, but for me, the idea is that I use some of those tools to help people process their religious experience. All right, so what's your take as an actual therapist?
Yeah. No, I think that all of what you said is, yeah, I think right on the money in a lot of ways. And just, I think that there's a lot of, yeah, it's hard to know at times when your role ends and a different role begins. And
Mm-hmm.
I say all the time when I'm working with clergy people and campus ministers and other folks who are kind of offering pastoral care, that
Mm-hmm.
ideally this work happens simultaneously of the work that I do and
Yes.
that y'all do, as you get to journey alongside a person in that spiritual dimension and work with them at finding the theological language or the resources they need for their spirit to process the things that are happening to them and to feel connected to the world around them. I say all the time that
Mm-hmm.
spirituality to me is what anchors your soul to the world around you. And like
Yeah.
that doesn't have to be necessarily a religious thing. For a lot of folks it is, but yeah, it's kind of what anchors your soul and your spirit to your body and the world around you. And so
Yeah.
yeah, the work that you do as a pastor is helping people kind of access that language and working with them to do that and journeying alongside them. And the work that I do is kind of more, how do we equip each other with the coping mechanisms and the skills and the tools that
Mm.
we need to like reframe our thoughts and to do more of that kind of psychoanalytic work, or of like
Yeah.
kind of like more of the like actual like distress, and like how do we
Mm-hmm.
recognize more of the like, a lot of diagnoses that you would hear kind of in the therapeutic space are kind of based on the effects that someone is having to their like ability to exist in the world around them. So like
Yeah.
affecting their ability to like get up and go out of their house or exist in social spaces. And so a lot of the work that I do is kind of equipping people with the language and the tools and the skills to be able to like work on some of the like we would say like symptomology of their anxiety or distress.
Yeah, Mrs. Dorpat, one of the users that's on our live stream, says, pastoral counseling has really harmful forms and also beautiful forms for me. In my experience, it is hinged on the individual in the pastoral role knowing their limits. Yeah, I think
Yep.
absolutely.
Yep.
One of my favorite, I had this season when I was working in one area where there was a psychologist, who, that somebody who practiced that form, had that qualification for therapy, who we developed a relationship. I would refer people to him, and he would actually refer people to me. So the ethics in his qualification did not allow him to venture into the theological realm. But when people had things that in therapy that they were needing to process the actual theology part of it, what does God think about it, or whatever, he would call me up, tell me what they were, obviously get their permission, but call me up, tell me what this theological issue was that they were dealing with, ask me like what my approach would be for a response, to make sure I'm not damaging them, and then make the connection. And I'd have the pastoral side of that meeting. And I really loved that because, like what you said, hopefully these things are happening in tandem.
Yeah. 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 And yeah, that's ideally the way that the work would happen. And also recognizing like in some like religious trauma spaces too, like they don't have access to the spiritual care and the theological care. And so that's why it's really important for me, kind of as someone who is ordained and theologically trained and also as a therapist, to be able to have the language from both sides, for some folks to be able to kind of give both of the theological and the clinical language, for folks who don't have the resources at the moment to be able to access like a pastor and a therapist. And so I get to kind of step into the role of being a little bit of both in some ways, which is why the work that I do is like my ministry. Like the therapy that I do is my like ordained ministry.
Yeah, that's really cool. I love that. And as I'm listening to you, I'm just struck by the fact that so many people don't really have access to this kind of perspective.
Mhm.
And I was I've been I have contact with thousands of people every week, telling me their stories, and and I hear so often these stories of people that have a hard time accessing this kind of thing, in part sometimes because they're into this high control religion that shames them, and if it ever got out that they actually saw a therapist, they would have a problem. Okay, we've got another question on Instagram. What is the link between trauma and abuse in a church setting?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Yeah, and I think it all kind of a lot of that work depends, or not depends, is kind of looking at like what is the definition of these things. And so abuse is an action that is done to another person, and trauma is the way that that abuse is experienced. And so kind of definitionally, like that is kind of the difference between abuse and trauma. But yeah, and I mentioned earlier that religious trauma is something that we kind of look at as something that maybe in some cases is a like capital T trauma, is what we would say, of like a specific event that happened to a person,
Mm-hmm.
whether that be some form of like actual like tangible abuse that happened to them in a religious space. But also at the same time, it's kind of at times a more like chronic abuse of power, or existing in a space that has been harmful for them for a long period of time. And so I kind of used the language earlier of CPTSD, of like
Mm-hmm.
chronic or complex PTSD, of recognizing that sometimes trauma is experienced from the abuse of existing within a religion or a religious space that has harmed who you were over the course of your life. And
Yeah.
exiting that space or becoming kind of more aware of that harm that has been done. And so I think for a lot of particularly like LGBTQ folks, like in
Yeah.
religious spaces, like I grew up in a very small rural town in um, the middle of nowhere, Western North Carolina, and
Hmm.
wouldn't say that I experienced a capital T trauma in religious spaces, but
Yeah.
grew up in a religious space that throughout the course of my childhood and adolescence taught me a theology that was really harmful to me as a queer person. And so
Yeah.
exiting that space, recognizing the harm that was done over 18 years of my life was kind of where that recognition of the, like, I'd say like the abuse and the trauma is happening.
Yeah. So you and I are both queer people who are ordained, and you know, I have a similar experience to you, but I also identify deeply with people in the queer community that have experienced religious trauma, and so I wonder if we might move a little bit into that space, and you know, for queer people that are still interested in spirituality, but have, you know, been, however it's happened, you know, pushed out of formal religion. Where would you say they start in processing, thinking through what happened in a way that might allow them to open themselves up, if not to, um, if not to an actual church, at least spiritual exploration again?
Yeah, I think a lot of the language that kind of exists broadly in the cultural space of this kind of work is that deconstruction language and that deconstruction
Hmm.
of religion. And I say all the time, my favorite metaphor for that deconstruction work is that we are taking kind of the inventory of the kitchen cabinets of our.
Hmm.
I think that language comes from Rachel Held Evans and some
Hmm.
work that she does, and it's kind of, yeah, being able to like open up the kitchen cabinets of our spirit, pull out the mugs, and say, "Hey, this mug that I've had for so long has a little chip on the lip of it, and every time I drink out
Yeah.
of it, it cuts my lip every single time. I
Hmm.
don't need to use this anymore." And being like, it has maybe some sentimental value, but not enough sentimental value to really keep it because I'm going to keep using it and keep cutting my lip every single time. And so
Yeah.
kind of the work that I do and the work that I like encourage a lot of folks who have this religious trauma into is being able to do some of that work of being able to take kind of the take everything out of the cabinets. We're going to empty them out and then we're going to start putting things back in. And so for right now, like for some clients, it's like, hey, right now the only mug that I have in my cabinet is that God is love. Period. That's it.
There you go.
That's for all that I have right now is that. But hey, that's all I need for right now. And kind of being able to slowly do that work of like, as we read more and do more research and have more experiences and kind of begin to more form more of that personal theology of who God is, we put more things in the cabinet. But
Yeah.
now maybe that's all we've got. And so I think that a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that I have done personally too is kind of that work of, yeah, that deconstruction work of really like doing the analyzing of like what is in my kitchen cabinet of faith.
Hmm. Yeah. I really appreciate that metaphor. One of the things that I often I guess recommend to people is I think dealing with like exploring spirituality after, you know, experiencing religious trauma or just like being pushed out of a church or whatever it is. Um, I find that doing that on your own is very difficult. It can feel isolating and it can feel frustrating. And finding like a safe community, a safe place to do that can be really, really helpful. And I actually am part of a group like that. We call it Not Church, and I'm the pastor of that group.
Yeah.
And Not Church is a place where people of all kinds of spiritual identities and non-identities are coming together and and being there for each other, supporting each other, processing all of these random religious things, posting memes and pictures of our pets. So, but the reason we call it not church is because somebody once said it's like church. It's got all the things that they missed from church, the community, the people of similar values that are trying to explore things together. Without somebody judging them because they've got a tarot deck on their bedside table.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, we have shaped that community very intentionally to feel safe for people who have experienced all kinds of different religious trauma. And as you mentioned earlier, one of the common forms that it takes is around money. And so one of the unique things about this spiritual community is that we don't ask for donations. Everything we do is pay for what you get. And so, just like the coming into that community, it's a Patreon subscription. It's $3 a month. At the same time, we don't want to be part of the capitalistic systemic injustice that preferences people with expendable income for things like access to a spiritual community. So anyone who ever is $3 is too much for them. You can just DM me and I'll give you a way to get in for free. But the great thing is you just try it. And if it doesn't work for you, you don't have to go to a pastor and say, like, can you take my name off the rolls? Like, you just stop paying.
Yeah.
And there's that. But it's really beautiful. It is a place where there's just not fights. It's very supportive, and I love it. It's the kind of church setting that I've always wished I could be part of. And if you want to check it out, there's a link in my profile to go and be part of this not church community. And Presley is actually in our Not Church community, and she says, "I'm a part of Not Church, and it has really helped me so much." Presley, thank you for saying that, like, out loud. um, uh, yeah, that's really wonderful. And Justice, what role does community and other people play in dealing with religious trauma?
Yeah, I'd say that it is, I mean, a big role, if not the biggest role for a lot of folks. Yeah, I
Okay.
think that one of the things that I recognize and experience a lot in kind of the religious trauma space is also like whenever people are leaving harmful religious spaces, some of the hardest parts of leaving those spaces is the fact that church is a space for community for a lot of folks. It is their like primary social sphere where they like experience community and friendships and like experience those types of relationships. So when they have to leave that space because it has harmed them, often they don't have access to those relationships anymore, and
Mm,
it's very socially isolating. And so a big part of this work is being able to experience and get reconnected into spaces of community.
yeah.
And it's kind of looking at kind of, like I said earlier, this definition of spirituality that doesn't have to be religious, of like where are the communities that feed your spirit. And like that doesn't have to be a church community. It can be a not church community, like the one that you're but it can also be, like your local book club that you find a lot
Hmm.
of really good connection in, and you're finding a lot of kind of like what you would maybe to consider like spiritual fulfillment of being anchored
Yeah.
to your body and the world around you by being in community with these folks. And so,
Hmm.
a lot of the work that I do is kind of helping people access those communities, and also recognizing like if they get to a point where they want to access more of like a spiritual religious community and going to a church, of being able to like do some of that work of like how do we find a church in your area that feels a little bit safer, or
Yeah.
feels more safe for you to do that work in, um,
Yeah.
which is hard. It's hard work to do, and it's work that needs to be done.
Okay. So I'm curious, because I actually hear from a lot of people that are like in a church. And there is this community. There's all these relationships that they've built up, sometimes over years and years.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes over their whole lives. But they do feel like they don't know if they can stay. They don't know if they should stay. And so, Justice, if I came to you as my therapist and I said, look, I don't know if I can or should stay in this church, but I'm afraid to leave because of all of the things in my life that I'll have to leave behind.
Yeah.
What kind of questions would you ask me? uh, to help me process that decision?
Yeah, I think kind of in order for me to do that work more kind of like, yeah, faithfully in that space, we would engage in kind of, like I said earlier, this little bit of this storytelling of like being able to tell like, okay, what are the aspects of this community that are really helpful that you find really important? Like what are the really like key aspects of this
Hmm.
your life? And also like let's talk about like where is the concern or the frustration or the harm happening, and kind of putting those in tandem and putting those in conversation with one another. And I think a lot of the work that I
Hmm.
do is also setting up kind of hypotheticals and like providing a space where we can kind of test them out of being like, what do you think it would look like if you like went to a member of your community and asked like, hey, like I don't know if I want to stay in this space, but I don't want to lose this community. What would it look like
Yeah.
for that? And we may not know, and then we get to kind of experiment some of that. And as even in the unknown of it, we get to prepare for that conversation of like, well, if you feel like that's something that you want to do, like I encourage you to try it. And if and but in as I'm encouraging you to try it, I'm also encouraging you to like name the spaces where you care for yourself before and after that conversation, um,
Right.
and making
W- w-
sure that care is a part of the conversation.
Right. Yeah, no, that's helpful. Um, Now, as you are, I know that as a therapist, right, there are sort of extreme things that people might report to you that, normally I think if somebody says like, I don't know if I should go to this church, you're gonna like process with them or whatever. There are probably a handful of things that if they say like this is happening, you would say get out. Let me work with you on how to get out as quickly as possible. So, as people are listening to the live stream or the podcast version of this, are there things that like would be such huge red flags that you would be like, okay, you need to talk with somebody about getting out of that situation as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I think there is that boundary, of course. And I think yeah, I mean, I we talked earlier about like abuse. I mean, of course, if you're experiencing abuse, like probably shouldn't be in communities with the people that are abusing you or have abused you.
Right.
Like that's a big red flag of like, hey, we should get out. But
Yeah.
also I think at the same time, like experiencing like intimidation or even threats or accusations or feeling like you aren't being trusted or being like ostracized or you're being kind of singled out in a specific setting,
Hmm.
I think are more kind of red flags. And I think a lot of the work that I do is also recognizing that a lot of high control spaces tell people that they cannot trust their own experiences, emotions,
Hmm.
and like bodily reactions. And so
Hmm.
being able to like recognize like, hey, do you feel like you know or have access to who you are? Like, do you
Yeah.
have a sense of autonomy? And a big part of that is like a loss of autonomy is a big part of this high control, like in this religious power and control. And so if we start to recognize like we don't have any individual sense of autonomy, it's probably not a good thing. We need to recognize
Yeah.
that we probably should get out of those spaces. And also like it's so much easier to say like, yeah, leave a space if you're experiencing this than
Hmm.
and often in reality. And so recognizing the nuance of that is also, I think, really important work.
Yeah. Yeah. As you said that, I really identified with that. Do you know who you are? And like the way they teach about things. Like for me as a queer person,
Mhm.
growing up, and even as, into adulthood, like, what I was taught was being gay was, a sin. And anything that would indicate that you were was actually just temptation or falling prey to temptation. And so, and when that's programmed into you from a really, really young age,
Yeah.
right? It creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of like really difficult things personally, but it also, it stops you from being able to answer that question. Like, do you know who you are? I'm curious, are there other common teachings, or I guess maybe even underlying values, but whatever. Are there other common teachings that sort of exhibit a high control or dangerous for people in terms of like, oh wow, this is a really high control religious space? Like, can you point to other things besides like doubting your own experience?
Yeah, I think yes, there are, and I think off the top of my head, an example that I think I see a lot in the work that I do is also recognizing where folks have experienced maybe some of this, what we would call maybe like a spiritual bypassing, which is
Hmm.
kind of you experience some type of either doubt or question or distress or challenge
Hmm.
in life, and the immediate reflex or response that you've been given by your church community that is the only response that you're allowed to access is like, well, God's got it, or like there's a plan and that's okay.
Hmm.
And this kind of like dismissal of maybe the harm that you are experiencing or the distress that you're experiencing, and kind of immediately moving
Right.
straight to spiritual language of like, well, if I pray about it, it's all going to be okay. And that almost like
Yeah,
prosperity gospel of it all is, yeah,
for
I think that
sure.
it's a lot in the work that I do.
Yeah. I'm curious about the way maybe you've seen a theology of forgiveness used to hurt people. Like, I was talking to a friend a couple of nights ago who was telling the story of a um, of a family member who experienced some awful things at the hands of their spouse, and when they talked to the people at their church, they said, "Well, you just need to forgive your spouse and reconcile with them," even though these kinds of things are things that like are really hurtful and damaging, and staying long term in that kind of relationship is probably not the best idea. So, how have you seen like forgiveness and a theology of forgiveness used and contributed to religious trauma?
Yeah, and I think you named it pretty, that example names it pretty clearly of, yeah, I think a lot of folks are in those high control spaces, or in those in those kind of harmful religious spaces, are either required or strongly encouraged to always kind of take the high road or turn the other cheek in a lot of ways. And um, yeah, have conversations and have to like forgive or reconcile with their own like abusers, or like
Yeah.
who are doing them harm. And
Hmm.
that's another way I think of that kind of loss of autonomy, like I said earlier, of being able to not trust your own experiences because you're being forced to forgive, or you're being forced to have like, yeah, reconciliation conversations with people who have harmed you, not
Hmm.
out of a desire to do that work, but out of a desire to, or not even a desire, out of a like mandate from your religious community, because that's what, like a lot of these spaces would say, like that's what God would want you to do, like that is the Christian thing to do, is to offer that forgiveness, when in reality, like offering that forgiveness is continuing to perpetuate harm for yourself.
Yeah. You've brought up abuse several times, and abuse in religious settings, regularly hits the news. And the response I hear all the time is like, "How does this can keep happening?" And I have my own theories, but basically, I feel like a lot of times the culture and the teaching of a lot of these spaces actually is what uh, gives a space that is primed for abuse and primed for like that being easy to cover up or dismiss. Um, so which is something that like if you're a person that is involved in a faith community, um, it's helpful to be able to identify like what are some of those kinds of red flags, warning signs, things that should make me lean in and try to look a little closer. Um, what are some of the things that you feel like in your work you've heard and you've said, "Oh yeah, yeah, that has contributed to opening up a space that is much more primed for abuse to happen."
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think about the most in that is kind of, yeah, I think there's a level of being in religious leadership, and I mean, kind of as ordained folks, like particularly in our tradition, we are if encouraged or reminded often of what it means to be in kind of like the word servant leadership is something, a word
Hmm.
we use in our tradition a lot for being ordained. But I think I talk with a lot of clergy people, pastors, and campus ministers, and a lot of the work that they do is also recognizing, like, hey, like, you have power over the people in your congregation, whether you know it.
Hmm.
And like
Yeah.
recognizing, like, just the fact that you are a person's pastor, a person's like spiritual leader, like that requires, or that is a power differential in a lot of ways. And like
Yeah.
that doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it often
Hmm.
can become a bad thing when we're not aware of what that dynamic it looks like. And I think recognizing or being able to look at kind of how a religious leader is using their power,
Hmm.
and like handling that power, like are they doing it in a servant leadership kind of way where they are very humble about the fact that they are in leadership and also like cognizant of that and the boundaries that they set and the ways that they exist within that space, or are they abusing that and using that power to control and to like
Hmm.
that power over the people that they are supposed to be the like spiritual leader of. And so I think a lot of the work is also recognizing, like, yeah, like how are the people in your religious spaces recognizing where they have a power differential and using that power in ways that like feels healthy to the people that are kind of their congregants and are kind of in some ways of under that power.
Yeah. And, some of the stories that I've heard from people, is, in a lot of high control religious spaces, there is this pressure to not doubt or question, Christianity, the theological values of that organization. There also sometimes is a culture of not doubting or questioning the pastor or church leaders,
Yeah.
and that being is sometimes fueled by the way a church leader talks about decisions, right? And so sometimes I've heard I've been in a church where a pastor wanted to build a building that was way more expensive than the church could afford. Ultimately, ended up bankrupting the church, but instead of saying like, I have a vision to build this building, blah blah blah, it was, I had a dream, and God appeared to me and told me that we needed to build this building, and so all of a sudden now we have invoked God to support a decision of the pastor, and and as it was going, like there was multiple times where banks were turning us down, that kind of stuff, and but the pastor kept coming back to like, but God told us to do this, so God will make it happen. And that was about a building, but that happens about all kinds of things in religious spaces,
Yeah.
and I think that sometimes is an indication, if that's how some of the decisions are being made. That's one of the indications that a pastor is abusing that power.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think kind of the way that I would, yeah, work against that sometimes in that space is you said the words like, God is telling us to do this thing. And it's like,
Right.
okay, well, is God telling us to do this thing, or is God telling you to do this thing? And we just have to
Hmm.
say that that is what God is telling us to do. Like
Right.
that, where that work, I think a lot of that work happens
Yeah.
is the pastors say like the end all be all. Like if the pastor says God's telling us to do this, like where's the space for you to say like, is God telling us to do this, or is God telling you and you're deciding
Mhm.
along with it?
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, Justice is an LCSW. He is a reverend. He is an ordained deacon. He has all of these things. And Justice, I really appreciate you being on this live stream and on the Unbelief podcast. This whole conversation is going to be released on the Unbelief podcast. You can just search for Unbelief wherever you find podcasts. And if you're listening to the podcast, if you know people who are trying to process religious trauma, sharing this episode with them could really help. And also, if you want to help us, rate us on whatever podcast platform you are, give us all the stars, maybe even take a moment just to write a comment and say, this podcast doesn't suck. But Justice, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and also thank you for this space, this community, this not church, and all of the work that you're doing. It's, yeah, important work and makes my job easier.
Thanks so much. You're so kind.